By summer 1945, the United States Navy possessed 563 destroyer escorts, representing the largest single class of warships ever constructed by one nation. These vessels, built with remarkable speed across dozens of American shipyards between 1943 and 1945, now crowded anchorages from Norfolk to San Diego, from Pearl Harbor to the Philippines. Each measured 306 feet in length, displaced approximately 1,400 tons, and had been designed for one specific purpose: hunting submarines in the Atlantic and Pacific. With the surrender of Germany in May and Japan in August, that purpose had vanished overnight. The question facing naval planners was immediate and practical. What does one do with 563 warships that are suddenly obsolete? The challenge was unprecedented in naval history. Never before had any fleet faced such a dramatic transition from total war to peace. These destroyer escorts, known universally as DEs, had cost roughly $6 million each to construct, representing a combined investment exceeding $3 billion. They consumed fuel, required crews of 186 men each, needed constant maintenance, and occupied valuable berths at naval facilities worldwide. The Navy's Bureau of Ships began calculating the costs of simply maintaining this enormous fleet in reserve, approximately $850 million annually. With wartime budgets collapsing and Congress demanding demobilization, keeping every destroyer escort in commission was financially impossible. Yet these were modern warships, less than 3 years old on average, with potentially decades of service life remaining. The destroyer escort program had been America's answer to the U-boat crisis of 1942 and 1943. Designed to be simpler and cheaper than fleet destroyers, these could be mass-produced using prefabrication techniques and diesel or turbo-electric propulsion systems that didn't compete with the steam turbines needed for larger warships. The results had been remarkable. American shipyards delivered destroyer escorts faster than any other warship type, with some vessels going from keel laying to commissioning in less than 6 months. By war's end, these ships had sunk 67 German U-boats and numerous Japanese submarines whilst escorting thousands of convoys across both oceans. Their success made them valuable. Their numbers made them disposable. The Navy would have to choose which destroyer escorts deserved preservation and which would face the scrapyard, a decision that would shape American naval power for the next quarter century. The situation in late 1945 presented naval administrators with competing pressures. On one hand, the emerging Cold War suggested that submarine threats had not vanished but merely changed flags. Soviet submarine construction was accelerating, and the Red Navy had captured numerous German U-boats, complete with their advanced technology. On the other hand, the American public demanded rapid demobilization. Congress slashed naval budgets by 75%, and shipyards that had produced destroyer escorts now needed to return to commercial work. The Navy faced an immediate decision: which DEs would remain in active service, which would enter reserve, and which would be scrapped or sold. The destroyer escort fleet itself was remarkably diverse despite its apparent uniformity. 6 distinct classes had been constructed, each with different propulsion systems, armament configurations, and capabilities. The Everts class, the earliest, numbered 97 ships with diesel-electric propulsion. The Buckley class, with 154 examples, used turbo-electric drive and featured improved anti-submarine armament. The Cannon class, numbering 72, returned to diesel-electric propulsion, but with different reduction gearing. The Edsall class comprised 85 ships with diesel engines. The Rudderau class, with 72 vessels, represented an improved Buckley design. Finally, the John C. Butler class, the most advanced, numbered 83 ships, with steam turbine propulsion that made them faster than their predecessors. This variety complicated preservation decisions, as maintaining 6 different types of machinery and spare parts inventories would prove expensive. By December 1945, the Navy had formulated its initial plan. Approximately 100 destroyer escorts would remain in active commission distributed across both the Atlantic and Pacific fleets. Another 200 would enter the reserve fleet, properly preserved and maintained for potential reactivation. The remaining 263 vessels faced disposal through scrapping, sale to Allied nations, or conversion to other purposes. This decision reflected both strategic calculation and economic reality. The Navy recognized that future conflicts might require convoy escorts, but keeping 563 ships operational was financially untenable. The selection process began immediately, with naval architects and operational planners evaluating each vessel's condition, capabilities, and potential utility. The American approach to its surplus destroyer escorts differed markedly from how other Allied powers handled captured Axis equipment. The United States owned these ships outright, giving it complete freedom to dispose of them as it saw fit. There was no Allied Control Council directive mandating destruction, no international agreement limiting numbers, and no rival power racing to claim them. Instead, the Navy faced a purely internal debate about balancing capability retention against cost reduction. This domestic focus would produce outcomes quite different from the fate of captured German or Japanese warships. The destroyer escorts selected for continued active service represented the newest and most capable examples. The Navy prioritized a John C. Butler class and later Rudderau class vessels, which offered the best performance and most modern systems. By mid-1946, approximately 87 destroyer escorts remained in commission, serving primarily with the Atlantic Fleet anti-submarine warfare squadrons. These vessels conducted regular patrols, training exercises, and showed the flag in foreign ports. Their crews, now volunteers rather than wartime draftees, maintained the ships to peacetime standards, whilst naval planners debated their long-term future. The Reserve Fleet program absorbed 203 destroyer escorts between 1948. These vessels were systematically prepared for long-term storage at facilities in Norfolk, Virginia, Charleston, South Carolina, Orange, Texas, and San Diego, California. The preservation process was thorough and technically sophisticated. All machinery was drained, cleaned, and coated with protective compounds. Electronics were removed and stored in climate-controlled warehouses. Guns were preserved with special greases and covered. Hulls were cleaned, painted, and regularly inspected. The goal was to maintain these ships in condition, allowing reactivation within 90 days if necessary. The Navy classified this as the Mothball fleet, and it represented a significant commitment to retaining destroyer escort capability, even whilst reducing active strength. The disposal of surplus destroyer escorts proceeded along multiple parallel tracks. Scrapping claimed the largest number, with 147 vessels sold to commercial shipbreakers between 1946 and 1948. Most went to yards in New Jersey, Texas, and California, where they were systematically dismantled. The steel was valuable in the immediate post-war period as American industry retooled for peacetime production. Each destroyer escort yielded approximately 800 tons of scrap steel, 15 tons of copper, and smaller quantities of brass, aluminum, and other metals. The scrapping process was efficient but final. These ships, many with less than 2 years of actual service, were reduced to raw materials within weeks of arriving at the breakers' yards. Foreign military sales provided homes for 79 American destroyer escorts between 1946 and 1952. This program served multiple purposes. It disposed of surplus vessels, strengthened Allied navies, and maintained American influence in post-war maritime affairs. France received 13 destroyer escorts under the Mutual Defense Assistance Program, commissioning them between 1950 and 1952 to rebuild its navy after wartime losses. The Netherlands acquired 8 vessels, redesigning them as frigates and using them for colonial defense in the East Indies. Brazil obtained 7 destroyer escorts, which became the backbone of its anti-submarine force. Italy received 4 vessels. Greece took 6, and smaller numbers went to the Republic of China, Uruguay, and other nations. These transfers were carefully managed, with American technical teams training foreign crews and establishing maintenance procedures. The most extensive foreign deployment involved the transfer of 18 destroyer escorts to Japan between 1953 and 1956. These vessels became the foundation of the Japanese Maritime Self-Defense Force, established after the 1951 Security Treaty. The destroyer escorts were redesigned as patrol frigates to comply with Japan's post-war constitution, which prohibited offensive military forces. Japanese crews received extensive training at American facilities before taking delivery of their ships. This program proved politically sensitive, as it involved giving warships to the recently defeated enemy. But strategic logic prevailed. American planners recognized that Japan's geographic position made it crucial for containing Soviet Pacific ambitions, and a capable Japanese Navy served American interests. Conversion programs transformed 47 destroyer escorts into specialized vessels serving new purposes. The most significant conversion created radar picket escorts, designated DER, which received enhanced radar systems and communication equipment for early warning duties. 26 destroyer escorts underwent this conversion between 1949 and 1952, emerging with distinctive tall radar masts and expanded operation centers. These DER conversions reflected changing naval priorities as the threat shifted from submarines to aircraft and guided missiles. The converted vessels served along both American coasts and in the Pacific, providing distant early warning coverage before the development of sophisticated airborne and satellite systems. 12 destroyer escorts became high-speed transports, designated APD, between 1945 and 1946. This conversion removed some armament and installed accommodation for 162 troops, along with additional landing craft davits. The APD conversions proved useful during the occupation of Japan and later during the Korean War, where fast transport of special forces and raiders remained valuable. The conversions were relatively simple, taking approximately 6 weeks per vessel, and extended the useful lives of ships that might otherwise have faced immediate scrapping. 5 destroyer escorts underwent conversion to experimental platforms for testing new technologies. The USS Fisk became a sonar test ship at the Naval Underwater Sound Laboratory in New London, Connecticut. The USS Eugene E. Elmore served as a trials vessel for new electronic warfare systems at the Naval Research Laboratory. These experimental conversions, whilst removing the vessels from combat service, contributed significantly to naval technological development during the early Cold War period. The Korean War's outbreak in June 1950 dramatically reversed the Navy's disposal plans. Suddenly, the Navy needed every available escort vessel for convoy protection, amphibious support, and blockade duties. Between July 1950 and December 1951, the Navy recommissioned 39 destroyer escorts from the reserve fleet. These vessels, some having been in storage for only 2 years, others for nearly 5, returned to active duty with remarkable speed. The mothballing process proved its worth, as most ships were ready for sea within the planned 90-day time frame. The recommissioned destroyer escorts served primarily in the Pacific, escorting supply convoys to Korea, providing gunfire support during amphibious operations, and conducting coastal patrols. The Korean War Reactivations revealed both the value and limitations of the destroyer escort design. These ships performed well in the confined waters around Korea, where their maneuverability and shallow draft proved advantageous. However, they were slow compared to newer destroyers. Their anti-aircraft armament was inadequate against jet aircraft, and their habitability fell short of peacetime standards. Naval planners recognized that whilst destroyer escorts remained useful for certain missions, they represented increasingly obsolete technology. New designs incorporating lessons from wartime service and post-war technological advances would eventually be needed by unflashing attrition. The post-Korea period saw continued attrition of the destroyer escort fleet through a combination of scrapping, foreign transfers, and conversion. Between 1953 and 1957, an additional 73 destroyer escorts were sold for scrap, As the Navy reduced its force structure, the reserve fleet shrank as well, with some vessels deteriorating beyond economical repair after years of storage. By 1960, only 62 destroyer escorts remained in active American naval service, down from the 87 operational. In 1946, the reserve fleet held another 94 vessels, though many were considered unlikely candidates for reactivation due to their age and outdated systems. The Soviet submarine threat of the late 1950s prompted one final major modernization effort. The Navy selected 35 destroyer escorts for conversion under the Fleet Rehabilitation and Modernization Program, known as FRAM. These vessels received updated sonar systems, improved anti-submarine weapons, including the new ASRO rocket system, and enhanced communications equipment. The FRAM conversions occurred between 1960 and 1962 at shipyards in Charleston, Long Beach, and Philadelphia. The modernized destroyer escorts gained another decade of useful service, with most remaining operational until the early 1970s. The final years of destroyer escort service stretched into the mid-1970s. The last vessels in American service, primarily FRAM modernized John C. Butler and Rudder-class ships, were decommissioned between 1972 and 1974. These final decommissionings occurred quietly, with minimal ceremony, as the Navy focused on newer frigate designs that incorporated gas turbine propulsion, guided missile systems, and helicopter facilities. The destroyer escort had served for 3 decades, far longer than originally planned, but technological progress had finally rendered them obsolete beyond further modification. Foreign service extended destroyer escort careers well beyond their American retirement. French ships remained operational until 1976, Netherlands vessels until 1967, and Brazilian examples until 1989. The longest service life belonged to destroyer escorts transferred to the Republic of China, with some vessels remaining in the Taiwanese fleet until 1999. These foreign careers meant that destroyer escorts, built in 1943 and 1944, operated for over half a century, defending nations far from their original construction sites. Preservation of destroyer escorts for museum display proved remarkably limited given their numbers and significance. Of the original 563 vessels, only 2 survive today. The USS Slater, a Cannon-class destroyer escort, is preserved in Albany, New York, after an extraordinary history that included service with the Greek Navy from 1951 to 1991. The ship was reacquired by American preservationists in 1993, towed back across the Atlantic, and restored to represent a typical wartime destroyer escort. The USS Stewart, an Edsall-class vessel, survived as a museum ship in Galveston, Texas, from 1946 until 1971, when deterioration forced its scrapping. The Stewart had served the Imperial Japanese Navy as patrol boat number 102 after being captured in 1942, then returned to American control in 1945, making it unique amongst destroyer escorts. The scarcity of surviving destroyer escorts reflects several factors. Unlike larger warships such as battleships or aircraft carriers, destroyer escorts generated little public enthusiasm as museum candidates. They were workhorses rather than symbols, functional rather than glamorous. Their relatively small size made them difficult to convert into viable museum facilities with adequate exhibition space. By the time preservation consciousness emerged in the 1960s and 1970s, most destroyer escorts had already been scrapped or transferred to foreign navies. The costs of maintaining a destroyer escort museum ship, whilst lower than for larger vessels, still exceeded what most preservation groups could afford. The technological legacy of the destroyer escort program influenced American naval design for decades. The mass production techniques pioneered for DE construction informed post-war shipbuilding practices. The standardization of equipment and systems across multiple classes demonstrated the value of commonality in fleet logistics. The destroyer escort size and capabilities established parameters that influenced the design of later frigate classes, particularly the Knox-class frigates of the 1960s and Oliver Hazard Perry-class frigates of the 1970s. These subsequent designs incorporated lessons from 3 decades of destroyer escort operation, whilst adding modern propulsion, sensors, and weapons. The anti-submarine warfare tactics and technologies developed aboard destroyer escorts during World War II formed the foundation of Cold War ASW doctrine. Hedgehog mortars, improved depth charges, and increasingly sophisticated sonar systems all matured aboard Ds during wartime service and continued evolving in post-war years. The operational experience gained by thousands of American sailors serving aboard destroyer escorts created an institutional knowledge base that proved invaluable as the Navy confronted Soviet submarine expansion. The destroyer escort program also demonstrated the challenges of maintaining large reserve fleets. The Navy's experience with mothballing and reactivating DEs influenced decisions about preserving other ship types. The success of the Korean War Reactivations validated the reserve fleet concept, whilst the deterioration of some stored vessels highlighted preservation challenges. These lessons shaped subsequent reserve fleet management and influenced decisions about which ships deserved preservation versus scrapping. The story of America's destroyer escorts reveals how quickly military technology can transition from critical to obsolete. In 1945, these vessels represented modern naval power and proven combat effectiveness. By 1960, they were considered outdated training ships awaiting replacement. By 1975, virtually all had vanished from American service. The rapidity of this transition reflects both the pace of technological change and the economic pressures of maintaining large military forces during peacetime. Ships that cost millions to construct and thousands of lives to operate in combat were reduced to scrap value within 2 decades. The near-complete disappearance of destroyer escorts stands in stark contrast to the preservation of larger warships from the same era. Multiple battleships, aircraft carriers, cruisers, and fleet destroyers survive as museum ships across the United States. The destroyer escort's fate demonstrates that preservation depends not only on historical significance, but also on public perception, physical size, and available resources. The workhorses of the fleet rarely receive the same recognition as its champions. By any measure, the destroyer escort program represented a remarkable achievement in naval construction and operations. 563 vessels built in less than 3 years, successfully deployed across 2 oceans, effectively employed in anti-submarine warfare, and capable of serving for decades when properly maintained. Yet this achievement came with an inevitable conclusion. Most examples would be destroyed, sold, or allowed to deteriorate once their immediate utility ended. The few that survived in foreign service did so by accident of geography and recipient nation needs rather than deliberate preservation policy. The destroyer escorts that remain, primarily the Slater in New York, serve as tangible connections to an era when American shipyards produced warships at unprecedented rates. These surviving examples allow contemporary visitors to appreciate the cramped working conditions, functional design, and robust construction that characterized these vessels. Walking through the Slater's narrow passageways, examining its weapon systems, and experiencing its confined living spaces provides insights that photographs and documents cannot convey. Yet this single survivor represents less than 0.2% of the destroyer escorts constructed, a preservation rate that ensures most details of DE design and operations will be known only through archival research.